There have been many crimes against humanity, such as slavery, wars, and genocides. They're so infamous that they shape our society and make us constantly self-reflect. There have also been silent crimes, which are no less terrifying, but which are far less known. Forced sterilization is a vivid example of such. The idea of forced sterilization seems savage to most because we're born thinking that our right to have a child is unquestionable, but history has proven that the right is far from being objective. The Swedish forced sterilization policy, which started in 1934 and ended in 1976, had unprecedented scale in terms of the number of people affected and duration. It was a crime against humanity and an obvious violation of human right to reproduce. Despite apologies and monetary compensations to victims, there is still an astonishing gap in legal recognition of responsibilities of government and society for the crime which lasted 40 years. Two mega trends of the 20th century, socialism and eugenics, came together in Sweden to give start to the sterilization policy. In 1932, a member of the Social Democratic Party became the Prime Minister of Sweden. The aim of the party was to inculcate the idea of the country being people's home, which provides safety for everyone. The party was in power through almost the entire 20th century, with an unstable period in the 80s, which coincided with the end of the forced sterilization policy. Alfred Petrén was a part of the Social Democratic Party when he came to power, and he also simultaneously was a psychiatrist. This combination made him the one to propose the sterilization law. Professor Petrén believed that those who possess an inferior quality are a burden to society. Socialists are responsible for the two major cases of forced sterilizations in Europe, Germany and Sweden. But what makes the ideology prone to such measures of society improvement? Socialism is grounded in the ideas of equality. No rich, no poor, no segregation. Awful crimes arise from inequality, but equally awful crimes arise from equality. In order to achieve equality, it was necessary to remove the extremes, the rich by taxes, the socially unstable and diseased by sterilization. The term eugenics comes from Greek evgenes, good genus. The theory was defined by Francis Galton, Charles Darwin's cousin, in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. The obsession with eugenics was ubiquitous, and it thrived particularly in the USA, UK and Germany. These countries implemented measures to support the eugenics movement first. It's interesting that even after the attempts of the Nazis to purify their race ceased, Sweden continued to follow their eugenic plan for 30 more years. First traces of eugenics in law can be seen in 1915, when Swedish Parliament issued a law that prohibited feeble-minded and epileptics from getting married. Herman Lundborg was an influential Swedish eugenicist. He described the concerns of the Swedish scientific community regarding the patterns of heredity in his book The Danger of Degeneration and Guidelines for Its Prevention. In the book, he refers to people with inferior qualities as the internal enemy of the nation, which can be defeated by measures such as forced sterilization. The qualities considered inferior were pretty much the same worldwide: feeble-mindedness, mental instability, which at that time included homosexuality, and epilepsy. The reason for that is that they were actually discussed as international eugenic conferences, which were a series of conferences where scientists presented their findings in different fields that proved the danger of heredity of these qualities. The Swedish State Institute of Racial Biology was founded in 1922 in Uppsala. Its aim was to study the Swedish nation in order to improve public health. The nation has been very homogeneous throughout the history and has very few minorities and a limited inflow. Sweden dedicated an entire institute for the study of their own nation, which I think proves how withdrawn it was as a nation. This withdrawal resulted in genetic invariability, all our distant relatives, which made the society much more vulnerable to negative mutations. This issue, enhanced with the strive for a perfect society of the Social Democrats, led to the following dramatic development. The first sterilization law to enter into force in 1934 targeted those with mental illnesses and epilepsy. In 1941, the law was renewed, and now it also targeted people with certain behavioral traits: alcoholism, poverty, prostitution, and even propensity to commit rape. The policy had 63,000 victims out of a population of 7 million, while the American policy had 70,000 victims out of a population of 150 million. The scale of the issue in Sweden was 20 times bigger. Moreover, more than 90% of the victims were women. The policy ceased in 1976. What did forced mean in the context of Sweden? When a person was considered legally competent, for example epileptics, the government had to receive consent from the person in order to carry out the surgery. Victims didn't tend to give consent willingly, so they would be threatened until they did so. The first sterilization law stated that in case the victim was legally incompetent, consent must have been received from the closest relatives or guardians. The law of 1941 made any permission from the relatives unnecessary. The consent of such people is worth nothing, stated the Aftonbladet newspaper, one of the biggest newspapers in Sweden to this day, in 1933. After years of silence, the stories of some of the victims were told. A woman named Maj-Britt was one of the unlucky ones. She lost her mother at a young age, and when the Child Protection Services came to check her and her siblings, the kids were asked to undergo an IQ test. Maj-Britt didn't pass, and despite the begging of her father, was taken to an asylum and later sterilized. "I'm not ashamed, others should be," said Maria Norden to Dagens Nyheter. Norden was sterilized in 1942 at the age of 17. She was classified as feeble-minded and blackmailed into signing her own sterilization papers. The initiative came from her teachers at her boarding school. Stuart Johansson was fortunate enough not to share the fate of his fellows at the orphanage where he grew up. He and the other boys were living behind a 2-meter fence, and from time to time, one boy or another would be taken out, and those taken out were considered privileged by the rest of the boys. However, once those privileged ones came back, they had something the boys called a cut in the crotch. The newspapers were where the criticism of the policy could potentially come from, and it was their responsibility to oppose. But instead, they very actively supported the idea. Aftonbladet newspaper published an article in 1933 called The Sterilization Law that reflected the opinion of the society on the issue. In the article, the people of inferior qualities were labeled ill-fated and imperfect. Moreover, the article encouraged the people related or responsible for the sort of people in question to take initiative for them to be sterilized. Maria Norden was one of the victims who decided to speak up and demanded compensation from the government. Göran Persson, the Prime Minister, apologized for the years of the policy on behalf of the entire Socialist Party in 1997. Following that, in 1999, the Parliament issued a compensation law that stated that all the victims of the 1934 and 1941 sterilization laws shall get financial compensation if requested. The Swedish Church, Lutheran, did not express any active support for sterilization policy, but silent agreement is also a crime. Only in 1951, Swedish archbishops wrote a letter to all the priests addressing many modern issues of family life and childbirth, including forced sterilization. Their opinion on forced sterilization was neutral. Sterilization is a sort of physical harm, so the procedure must be well thought through before each surgery. And before each procedure, it's necessary to evaluate the possibility of bringing the patient into society without such invasive measures, with intense therapy or education. Nothing was said from the religious perspective, and no strong opposition was expressed. Science had failed to recognize that inferior qualities not only have a hereditary element, but are largely influenced by social and environmental factors. For example, heredity of intelligence is quite controversial. The work on heredity of feeble-mindedness was originally published by Henry Goddard in 1912. The measure of intelligence he suggested to use was IQ, and feeble-mindedness was defined as IQ lower than 70. There are problems with this approach. Even today, mechanisms of IQ heredity are not fully discovered. The fact that feeble-minded parents tend to raise feeble-minded children to a large extent is explained by worse access to education in poor families. Social Democrats had to focus on fighting poverty instead of using medical interventions. Today, IQ in the range 50 to 70 is considered a mild intellectual disability, which does not prevent a person from becoming a useful member of society. By now we have a good picture of whose rights were violated. But what was the main right violated, and who stated that right? The right to reproduce turns out not being as objective as it seems. It had not been written down until 1968 in the Proclamation of Tehran, among other human rights, and is debated to this day. Some still think that an individual or a family may not decide about their children without the government, because it's not just children, it's also new citizens. The right we're discussing lies on the intersection of several sensitive topics: discrimination, women's rights, and demographic policies of a country. The global acknowledgement of the responsibility for the violation came 40 years after the right was first formulated. In 2011, forced sterilizations were established as a crime in the Istanbul Convention, which Sweden ratified. But there are examples when countries abolished conventions. In the 20th century, Swedish scientific and political policies lent a lot towards discrimination, and you would expect the modern constitution of Sweden to strictly prohibit even a minor violation of reproductive rights. In reality, the current article of the constitution states that the government may not interfere with the people's family lives, except such as is in accordance with the law and is necessary in a democratic society in the interest of national security, public safety, or the economic well-being of the country, for the prevention of disorder or crime, for the protection of health or morals, or for the protection of the rights and freedoms of others. All these exceptions could justify the sterilization laws of 1934 and 1941, the ones that cost 60,000 people to be sterilized. And this makes me wonder, what prevents such a crime from happening again?
The sterilization laws were in force from 1935 to 1976, but no one protested at that time. The Social Democrats, they were interested in the quantitative amount. It was a kind of social work to pure the society from the poorest persons.
Charts here, the applications for sterilization. Here and this.
It's both women and men, and children too.
The reason is she couldn't take care of children, herself nor her family. She is diagnosed being feeble-minded since birth.
It was not a compulsory sterilization law. The doctors were having consent from the sterilized person, so to say.
But there were oppressions, perhaps?
Absolutely.
And the person here had something called dementia paralytics. The person is dement. Is that what you mean, an intelligence test?
And if the result was that the intelligence was below 12 years age, then they could, the doctors could sterilize the persons without their consent. And in another application which I have here I have only the school teacher. Here she is talking about the girl. She is 14 years old, and that the girl had left the school for several times, and she is sexually unreliable, and her face, how she looks, is not nice. She is also said to be absolutely feeble-minded, and this application is made in 1947, and the girl is sterilized without her consent. The single mothers, they were a major part of the sterilized in the beginning of the 50s, because the women got also the child allowances. And this could be a risk for the society, that the mothers will have more children to get the money.
All in all, it's 63.
In 1997, after an important debate, the Swedish government compensated the victims of eugenics.
And were many victims compensated?
No, not so many. And they had also to prove that they were sterilized by force or involuntary. And that is quite difficult when you have signed an application. How could you show the pressure in the situation? It's not in the files. There is a discussion in Sweden about the sterilization laws, if it is a part of the bad black history and the dark history of the welfare state, but I think it is a part of the welfare state.